Welcome to Lifting Your Spirit, a monthly broadcast in which we interview people about their spiritual lives and how they support others in lifting their spirit. I'm Reverend Joel Grossman, Interfaith Minister, Director of Spiritual Services for Constellation Hospice here in Newburyport, and also offer spiritual coaching on a donation basis virtually.
I'm Ted Jones. I'm a meditation teacher at the North Shore Insight Meditation Community.
Our show is based on the four following principles. 1, everyone is spiritual. Sometimes we are conscious and active in that, and sometimes not, but even when we're not, we're still spiritual.
And second, that there are many ways to lift your spirit, not only through formal religious practices, but through nature, art, human relationships, service to others, just to name a few.
Third, each person's spiritual path is unique and may change in small or large ways over time.
And fourth, that it's important to respect your own spiritual journey, trusting that one step leads to another, and to respect the uniqueness of other people's spiritual journeys, regardless of how different they may be from your own. We're not here to convince you of the benefit of any particular approach or method, rather just to give you some food for thought. We're very pleased today to have as our guest Chris Himmel. Chris is the owner and lead instructor of Great Bay Tai Chi, Massachusetts, headquartered at his studio, Internal Arts New England, which is in Salisbury, Massachusetts. Chris's passion for Tai Chi came from not only a love of martial arts, but also from a deep affinity for Daoist thought and related Eastern philosophy, as well as meditation. In addition to teaching Tai Chi and Kung Fu classes, Chris spent time teaching Qigong and meditation at an addictions recovery center, where he also functioned as a spiritual director. Since its founding in 2002, Internal Arts New England has grown as a studio for both martial and meditative practices and study. One of its newest offerings is a weekly Daoism Study Group, which Chris moderates and which draws attendees both in person and online via Zoom. So welcome, Chris. We're very pleased to have you here. And as always for us, we'll start by just asking you about your own spiritual journey, sort of where it started and how it's evolved over time.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm happy to have been invited and talk to you today. So my spiritual upbringing was kind of an interesting one, I guess. My father had been a student in a theology school before I was born. That's where he attended graduate school and had intentions to become a minister himself. And at some point along that process, he decided that wasn't going to be his path. He ended up dropping out of theological school, and then later on, after I was born, my family was not involved in a church community per se. Not until I was sort of in my early teenage years, maybe just a little bit earlier, my father kind of decided that it was time and a good idea for us to become involved in a church, and so we started attending a Congregationalist church in the town that we lived in. And I had a really hard time with that. I had a lot of resistance to it. But I went, and there were some good things to learn there, and I took what I could from it, but we didn't end up staying there for very long. My father later on discovered Unitarian Universalism and started attending those services, and I went with him to some of those. Those seemed to resonate a little bit better, but still wasn't quite the thing for me. At some point along the lines, I had been studying martial arts. I was very interested in Eastern philosophies and religions, and was doing some reading there and discovered Buddhism and later Daoism, And so I had some experience with the Tao Te Ching and was reading that, trying to get a handle on it. And this just sort of continued on throughout my adolescence, and as I tried to learn more and gain a better understanding.
That's really interesting that was in your adolescence. That's an early start. Did you have a peer group of people your age who had similar interests, or?
No, not particularly. I think it was mostly born out of the affinity I had for the martial arts. I was studying karate at the time, and was consuming a lot of the martial arts media of the day, and some of that sort of led me into, you know, these ideas that were present in Asian philosophy and specifically Japan at the time, and getting some experience with Zen Buddhism, and just was interested in learning that, and it resonated with me better than any of the sort of Abrahamic based traditions that I had been exposed to. So I continued with that, and was just kind of reading and trying to learn whatever I could, and was curious. And then late in high school and into my early college years, I was working at a bookstore, and I got to be the person in charge of the shelving for the philosophy section. And so I had a lot of opportunity to kind of peruse and see what came up. And I discovered a particular book called Chronicles of Tao. And I started reading that, and as I was going through it, it resonated with me very strongly, and I realized that this was already the way that I was thinking about the world, and just made a lot of sense to me. And so that's kind of what led me into doing a deeper dive into Taoism, and just started reading everything I could and tried to understand as much as possible.
So, want to sort of explore a little bit the relationship of Taoism and martial arts and other spiritual practices and martial arts. You know, I think that it's like many other spiritual practices. There's a commercialization which has occurred, and that, you know, for a lot of people, you know, it's say, well, I'll just take my kid to the karate class, and so reality that all these martial arts are based in some kind of spiritual foundation is sometimes lost, or maybe even often lost. So can you sort of explain how all that fits together?
I think that's really difficult from a Western perspective. I think the relationship between the martial practices and the philosophical or religious practices of their origins are just so entangled in the culture itself. And so for me, trying to ascribe that the martial art is born out of a philosophical or religious practice isn't necessarily correct. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding, and so much of my early introduction as far as connecting those two things was based on movies and books and you know, fiction writings that were still written by Western authors. And so I think a lot of that was a misunderstanding of how those things related. But it was an initial draw, and my interest in Japanese arts and philosophy, you know, came from an interest in what the samurai culture was like. And I think especially at the time, there was this sort of idea that the philosophy and the martial practice were almost one and the same. And later on, I sort of came to a conclusion that I don't think that's really the case. I think a lot of that had to do with our understanding of Japanese culture, and how that related to their martial practices. And then later on, I got, you know, Taoism is a Chinese philosophy, and I didn't come to Chinese arts until much later. But they're so deeply ingrained in the culture that you almost can't talk about one without the other. But to say that Tai Chi, for instance, is a Daoist art, I think is a misunderstanding, although a common one.
So the term Daoist has been expressed a bit. Could you say something about it for me and others who don't really understand?
Sure. So Taoism is a Chinese philosophy / religion, and is really kind of China's homegrown religion that grew out of their ancient shamanic practices. So the central text in Taoism is referred to as the Tao Te Ching, or the Lao Tzu, right? Lao Tzu is the purported author of the text. And it talks about a philosophy very much in tune with nature, and it refers to the Tao, which is usually translated as the way or the path. And it's a philosophy based around bringing one in accordance with the way that the universe and nature work, and observing the world around us and getting a feel for the importance of nature and what's the connection between all these things, and trying to bring yourself in line with that. So my most common visualization for this, I think the one that resonates with a lot of people, is to imagine the Tao as a river, and that we are floating in this river. And if we struggle against the current and fight to make the river do what we want, we will never win, right? The Tao is going to do what the Tao is going to do, just as the river is going to continue to flow. But if you surrender yourself completely to it, you're likely to end up getting thrown around and maybe smashed against some rocks or something like that. But if you can find a way to work with it and exert some influence over your own self and your own being that doesn't fight it, you can find the safest and happiest path. And that's sort of the way that I think about it.
Do you think it would be fair to sort of view the Tao, or that river, as similar to the middle way in Buddhism, and that the Tao is sort of roughly analogous to the Dharma in Buddhism?
I do think there's a lot of connection there. And so, yeah, the middle path that Buddhism refers to, that idea of not being an extremity, is definitely inherent in Taoism. In China in particular, these things are very, very deeply intertwined. So when we look at the history of Buddhism coming out of India and then moving into China, effectively what happened was the Indian Buddhism got mixed with Taoism, and that's how we got Chan Buddhism in China. And then Chan Buddhism moved to Japan, and you integrate a little bit of Japanese culture into those ideas, and you get Zen. So once you're talking about Chinese philosophy and religion, Taoism and Buddhism and even Confucianism become really, really intertwined in a very interesting way, so that it's very difficult to separate them at some points, but they all sort of have their own approaches.
What kinds of meditation practices are common in Taoism?
So in Taoism, there's a meditation practice called sitting and forgetting, or sitting in oblivion, which is essentially similar to the idea of no mind in Japanese Zen Buddhism. So that's a relatively common practice, though I think a very difficult one, especially those of us coming from a Western culture who haven't grown up with some of these ideas or a meditation practice. So a lot of the meditation that I do and that I teach is based on what we call Qigong. Qigong, it roughly translates as energy work or breath work. And there's a specific meditation practice called small circulation. Some people are also familiar with it being called the microcosmic orbit. And so that Qigong practice is generally a seated practice, but is a little more accessible to people than that sort of standard sit and don't think about anything type Zen meditation, because it gives us a key into the breath and some very specific visualizations to help us reach a more meditative state. So those are the ones that I will teach most often.
So Qigong also has a motion component to it.
Many Qigongs. So that there is a separation between seated or still Qigong, and then standing Qigong, and even moving Qigong. and depending on the way that you practice it, Tai Chi, right, the forms that people are often familiar with seeing people do in the park, right?
Yes.
That can be practiced as a moving Qigong. But many of my classes, we also what we refer to as Qigong usually refers to just a standing practice where we're standing in one place, but there is upper body movement coordinated with the breath and with our intention. So that's another form of Qigong. And then the seated practice that we described, that small circulation, would be a seated or still Qigong.
I think of Qigong as a healing art. Could you say something about different Qigong practices for different problems?
Yeah, so again, we run into a little bit of a translation problem because the term Qigong is a relatively new one, and it's a very, very big umbrella. So usually what I'm talking about could also be referred to as Neigong, which means internal work, as opposed to energy work or breath work. Separated from that is what they would call Weigong, which is external work, right? And so while Weigong fits under the Qigong umbrella, it's not what most people would ascribe that way. They're much more physical exercises with a lot of stretching involved. Some people sort of misconflate it as Chinese yoga, which I can understand how people get there, but they're not really the same practice. And then there is an idea of Qigong as a healing practice, as you say, to work on specific energies, and it's intertwined with Chinese medicine. So sometimes, like an acupuncturist would advise people to do specific Qigong sets. That can be really useful for people, but it all really depends on what approach you're using. And when you get into medical Qigong, right, when a TCM doctor, a traditional Chinese medicine doctor, an acupuncturist, might advise someone to do these, they might be specifically based on movements, they might be based on more in acupuncture theory about stimulating specific points to help work on an injury, but it's a very holistic practice. So like I said, Qigong is kind of a really big catch-all term for a lot of different practices.
And it comes out of the Daoist tradition, is that right? I'm really learning on the fly here. You are really, this is really great. I mean, you have a grasp of this that I'm trying to catch up to a little bit, sort of what sort of fits where.
And I think this is a big problem for us, again, coming from a Western culture, because we want to see things as separate when they're very often not. I would be a little reticent to say that Qigong comes out of Daoism. I would more say that it comes out of Chinese culture and traditional Chinese medicine, of which Daoist ideas are a part, right? So there's a lot of overlap there, but to say Qigong is a Daoist art, I think would be misconstruing, right? Daoism uses Qigong practices as part of its
so it's
curriculum,
different,
so
so to say, yoga being a Vedanic, it's pretty clear that they're very directly related in that way. This is more diffuse in terms of the influences out of which it grew.
I think so, and like I said, even the term Qigong is a relatively recent term. Really, I think only going back to maybe the mid 20th century. That term Qigong hasn't necessarily been around all that long. And I think in many ways it's used more here than it is maybe in China.
It's become very popular, at least the term has, in meditation retreats. So while you're sitting, but you can do the walking, or you can, there's a Qigong going on over here. Tai Chi, where is that from? What are the sort of wellspring out of which that has grown?
So Tai Chi is also a Chinese art, and again, against what most people sort of associate or think of it as, it originated as a martial art.
It was.
Its origins are martial, and it started as when we talk about Tai Chi, you often will hear talk about the 5 families, and And so the Chen family is credited with starting this art. And originally it wasn't called Tai Chi, it was called the Chen family boxing. And it was the Chen family's martial art that was passed down generally from father to son as it went through the generations. The style that I practice is known as Yang style, Yang being the second of the 5 families. And it's purported that our originator, Yang Lu Chan, studied with the Chen family. He was possibly a servant working for the family, and eventually was taught the Chen family art. And then he moved to Beijing and was teaching Yang family boxing, and so that became his art. And the name Tai Chi Chuan didn't come into use until a little bit later. And this is again where it gets confusing, because people associate Tai Chi very much with Daoism. So the words Tai Chi refer to the idea of yin and yang, right? And most people are familiar with the swirling symbol with the white dots and the black dot, right? But it appears that it got that name as essentially marketing to help popularize it. So Yang Lu Chan's grandson, Yang Chengfu, was the first person to really teach Tai Chi publicly outside of the family. And he's credited with giving it wider distribution into Beijing and into the rest of China. And it's somewhere around there is when they started calling it Tai Chi Chuan and using that word Tai Chi, because that's such an inherent concept in Chinese culture and Daoism, this idea of yin and yang. And so when we translate Tai Chi Chuan, it's usually translated as supreme ultimate fist, right? But supreme ultimate to us sounds like it must be the best of the best, right?
Yeah.
So Tai Chi Chuan is called the best of the best fists, right? It doesn't actually mean that. Tai Chi means the concept of yin and yang. So supreme ultimate could also be grand polarity, that separation of yin and yang from each other. And so Tai Chi Chuan really means martial art based on the theory of yin and yang. And that's where it kind of starts to overlay now with Daoism, because Daoism is very interested in that relationship. And so as time has gone on, and I think especially because some Westerners were able to learn this art when it moved, it was brought to New York and to California through Chinese immigration, and we had Westerners who were able to go to China and learn and then come back. And they had all this mixture of ideas about yin and yang and martial arts, and the one doesn't come from the other, but they did get overlaid. And so having that idea that these ideas are related, and there's a lot that we can talk about there, but not taking them as one brought about the other, I think is important for us.
Yeah.
I'm very, excuse me, interested in the name you chose for your business and how it relates to all of this.
So Internal Arts New England is the studio that I opened in Salisbury, and I chose that name. So internal arts, when we're looking at Chinese martial arts, they get divided very much like we talked about before about internal and external Qigong, right? Neigong and Weigong, right? And the word internal arts has been used to mean a few different things, but generally will refer to the 3 primary arts that I teach, one of which is Tai Chi, the second is called Xingyi Chuan, and the third is called Baguazhang. And these are considered very closely related arts in the Chinese martial arts community, and they're all based around the use of using very refined body mechanics in order to generate power. And so in the Chinese martial arts community, we'll look at Tai Chi Chuan and Xingyi Chuan and Baguazhang as starting from working very refined body mechanics and then doing power training later. And this is part of why those will get lumped together as what we call internal arts. External arts, on the other hand, or what sometimes we'll call hard style arts, tend to do the reverse. And they'll do power training up front, and then they do much more refined body mechanics later. So in essence, the curriculums are the same. They're just backwards from each other. And so, depending on who you're talking to, they'll tell you, well, Shaolin Kung Fu is very, very different from all this Tai Chi and Xingyi stuff, but they really should lead you to the same place. They just take very different approaches to get there.
Maybe you could talk a little bit about what people could expect entering your classes and the types of benefits that they might realize by doing that.
Sure. So we divide our Tai Chi program into two sets, one of which we refer to as Tai Chi for Good Health, and the other that we refer to as Martial Tai Chi. The Tai Chi for Good Health classes are our most popular. That's what most people come to us for, because Tai Chi has become best known as a health art rather than as a martial art. And we get people that come from practices like yoga and dance and other athletics and all these different things. And people are very often very surprised by how difficult they find the Tai Chi to be, because it asks you to move in a very different way than any of those other practices do. So the focus in the Tai Chi for Good Health program really focuses around alignment and coordination. And so we're working those refined body mechanics that we were just talking about. And because we have that relationship with Qigong and with meditation and thereby spirituality, there's a Qigong component in generally all of our classes where we slow everything down and try to relax, and we'll do some of the standing movement and just focus on the awareness of the breath and how we connect that into our body movement. Tai Chi is very well known for helping people with balance. It's also being used more now to help people that are dealing with things like fibromyalgia and Parkinson's disease, some of these neurological disorders that affect that connection between body and brain. And because Tai Chi asks you to go back and really revisit how you move and how you think about your movement, people are finding a lot of benefit with that, and it's helping stave off some of those symptoms and helping people deal with that for a much longer term. So as far as what to expect, if you enter a regular class, we generally start with just some easy warm-up sets. Because we're working refined body mechanics, Tai Chi is very much based around relaxation. And so a lot of the extra stiffness in our muscles that come from stress and overuse, one of the first things we want to do is try to loosen that up as much as we can so that our movement is really supple and accessible to us. And then we do in some very specific movement patterns to try to give ourselves a basis to work from. And then the center of the curriculum in the Tai Chi for Good Health classes is what we call the Yang style short form. So Yang style meaning from the Yang family, and short form meaning this is a relatively short sequence of movements that we do. And so the form in Tai Chi just refers to a particular sequence that we work on, and we do the same way from beginning to end generally every time. The Yang style short form takes about 5 minutes to do from beginning to end.
So are people going to be in a circle? Are they in line? Where's the instructor in the room? How does that all work?
So every instructor will do things a little bit differently. My classes, I tend to have people in lines for the warm-ups and for the movement practice and then for the form practice. Because the Tai Chi form moves across the floor, it's important that everyone go the same direction.
Yeah.
So being in a circle doesn't really help, right? Then we get a traffic jam. But at the end of class, when we're doing the standing Qigong, sort of as a cool down, that's when we'll have everybody be in a circle, and so it evens everything out that way.
Wow. Going in a little bit different direction, or maybe not, I'm very intrigued by being a spiritual advisor at a recovery center.
Yeah, I was surprised by that too, frankly, when that came up. So I was tapped by a friend of mine who is an acupuncturist who was working at an addiction recovery center in Haverhill, and she was offering acupuncture services there. And they wanted to bring in someone to do some Tai Chi. So she asked me to go over there, and I met with the team there, and they brought me on to teach some classes. And what we ended up doing was much more of what we would have called Qigong. I did a lot of seated Qigong meditation practice with them and a little bit of movement. And so these are people that we're talking about being in a residential facility. They're detoxing, they're dealing with withdrawal symptoms, they're trying to find strategies to get through their addiction. And it was a very interesting group to work with because most of the people that were there had no exposure to Eastern philosophy, didn't have any idea what Tai Chi was, didn't have any kind of meditation background. As you're probably aware, most addiction centers are working off of like a 12-step program, which tends to be very Christian-based, right, out of an Abrahamic kind of tradition. And so they brought me in to kind of have a different approach. And so it started off with just some really basic seated practices, a little bit of standing practice. And it certainly wasn't for everybody, and there were some people that it didn't resonate with at all and didn't see the use in. But there were a few people there that said it was really good for them, and they said it was the only thing that they were doing that was eliminating their cravings for some length of time, right? For some people it might have been an hour, for some people it might have been a few hours. But that ability to let go of their craving was such a relief to them that they really found benefit in it. And so they liked coming to those sessions and having those practices. But because the rest of the program was really centered around 12-step and Christianity, again, we had some people there that didn't resonate with. And so there were a couple people that I was asked to sit with and talk about what's an Eastern approach to this and how is that going to be different. And so that's where I sort of ended up taking on this spiritual advisor role and showing people that there were these other traditions out there, and that the way they'd been taught wasn't necessarily the only way to think about things. So that's how I ended up kind of in that role. It wasn't intentional, and it was just kind of a feel for the moment. And I don't have a degree in social work. I didn't have any experience there, but they just kind of said, no, you can do this. So they threw me in the room and said, have at it.
That's great.
Yeah, I think that's really important what you're saying. I mean, in theory, the 12 steps should not be Christian. It's a higher power, and that can be different for everyone. Real a big tent situation, but I think it's largely different parts of the country put a more or less degree of a Christian tinge to it, or even more than a tinge, and that you see that on people, meetings where people say the Lord's Prayer at the end. Well, that's blatantly a sort of religious overtone, where the program is a spiritual program, but you really in theory shouldn't have that. So it's really great that what you are doing there of sort of bringing in a other perspective, and that there's many paths to spiritual growth, and that the important thing in 12-step recovery is that it is a spiritual program, that it's
Yeah, and I don't have enough experience with 12-step to speak as in depth about it, but I do think that especially among people who maybe didn't have the resources that some of us did, the word higher power only means in a Christian context to some of them. And as much as any facilitator might be able to say, it doesn't have to be the Christian God, it doesn't have to be based in an Abrahamic faith, I'm not convinced that some of those people had any other definition for higher power. And so the education around that, I think, is important. And so I was glad to be able to help in whatever way I could for the people that wasn't resonating for. But it's a very different approach.
Let's talk some about your newest offering, the Daoism Group, and how you decided to do it, how it's going, whether people can sign up and join it, or is it just a resource that's ongoing, or is there sign up for 5 sessions or whatever?
Yeah.
How does it work?
The Daoism Study Group to me is really exciting, because as we talked about before, when I was getting interested in Eastern philosophy and Daoism, I didn't have a peer group to talk with. I didn't have other people that were that deeply interested in it. And so I was doing a lot of self-study and trying to figure it out and failing and trying to come back to it and see what I could do. But because I'd been reading these texts now for a few decades, and I thought, well, maybe there's a community here. We've got our Tai Chi classes, and sometimes in those classes we'll talk a little bit about the relationship between that and Taoism and the yin and yang theory and how to look at that. And some people kind of go, yeah, okay, let's do the movement again. But some people started to engage with it and found it interesting. And I said, well, all right, maybe there's enough people that are interested in this that we can talk about it. And so the Daoism Study Group is really a labor of love for me, where it was something I said, let's just see if there's a community of people that want to talk about this stuff. And there is. And we've managed to attract some people from outside of the school who are not my students, who are coming to the group. So we started in September, and we started with the Tao Te Ching and trying to read through it and see what we could figure out. And some of the people in the group had read the Tao Te Ching at some point in their lives, but sort of, as I think was very common, put it on a shelf and said, okay, I did that, and weren't really sure how to deal with it again. So
it was pretty popular back in the day
yes.
when, in the 60s, and but again, ended up on the shelf.
And yeah, it ends up on the shelf. And so I think there's a lot of households out there that probably have one sitting around, and maybe they tried to look at it and go, I don't understand this. Like, I'm not doing this anymore. But you brought up someone earlier that you're familiar with who
Yes.
Started coming to the group, again, was not my student, but emailed me ahead of time and said, I studied a little bit of Taoism in college, and so this is a person well past his college years, but said, I haven't had anyone to talk to about this stuff since then. And so yeah, let's do this. So like I said, we started with the Tao Te Ching, and so what the group has done so far has been to try to work its way through doing some comparison of translations, because not only is the Tao Te Ching being translated from Chinese into English, but it's being translated from classical Chinese, which is a much older written language. And so there's a lot of debate about what's actually here and what are these written texts and how do we interpret them. And so an interesting thing, as you said, it was so popular in the 60s and the 70s. A lot of people were reading this. The Tao Te Ching is second only to the Christian Bible in terms of the number of translations that are available.
Wow.
And I'm gonna forget the numbers now, but it's translated into something like 100 different languages, but there's something like 460 translations just into English. And so looking at all of these and trying to glean what we think the essence of the text is has been a really interesting exercise. And we've got some people who are somewhat familiar with the text, and some people that are coming to it for the first time, and don't really have any exposure to it. So we've been working our way through the text. We're just about halfway through it now, having started in September. And we had a visit just a couple of weeks ago from an author. If you have any science fiction fans in your audience, they may be familiar with an author whose name is Ken Liu. Liu is the spelling of his last name. He was involved in writing The Three Body Problem, which was just a big series on Netflix, and has done a number of other writings. Well, he also has a translation of the Tao Te Ching available. And he's relatively local. He lives in the Boston area, and he was willing to join us via Zoom and give sort of a guest talk about his process of translating and how he views it. and was a great way to get some more context into that. And we're crossing our fingers we can get him to come back again when we get through the rest of the book. But his translation has become one of the ones that we're referring to and looking at. And that's a very new translation. I think he just published it last year. So it's really interesting to go back and compare. But as far as your other questions, we're welcoming anybody at any time. This is a free offering. We're not charging for it.
Wow.
It's not a class. I moderate the group and I try to facilitate the group. But other than having been reading these texts for a number of decades, I don't have a degree in Daoist philosophy, and I don't claim to have expertise in it, so to speak. But it's been a really great way to help stimulate the conversation and tell people what I get out of the text. And so we've been doing that. We meet Mondays at 4:15, and we've got a good group of people that come to the studio to take part, and we've got people that join us online through Zoom. And it's been just a really great experience for me. And I keep telling people that they thank me for starting this group. I said, I did this for me. This was so that I could talk about this stuff, because I find it interesting.
So if somebody's interested, how do they go about making the connection?
So they can email me. We don't put the Zoom link out publicly because we want to be a little protective.
Yeah.
But if someone emails me and says, I'm interested in this group, I'm happy to send them the link. We also have on the Internal Arts New England website, we're archiving the meetings, and so people can go back and view the recordings and see what we've talked about so far. Again, those are password protected, so someone has to make contact with me so that they can get access to that resource. But it's there and it's available at no cost for people that are interested. So if anyone wants to look up our website, internalartsnewengland.com or greatbaytaichi.com, it's really easy to find my email address and my phone number. And I'm happy to have people reach out, and we'd love to have more people involved and engage with the group.
And the same contacts for your classes?
Yeah. So all of our regular classes are also posted on the greatbaytaichi.com website. People can see what our class schedule is, and again, if they want to reach out and email me or call me, I'm happy to talk with them and help them find the class that's going to suit their needs best. There is a contact form right on the website. They can just fill it out, and it guarantees a phone call or an email from me to reach out and make connections and see what people are interested in. But between the Daoist philosophy and the Tai Chi for good health, and then the martial Tai Chi program, and we've got a couple other classes running on a smaller basis, we try to do what we can to help fulfill people's needs and get them moving and engaged in a great health practice, a great mindfulness practice.
I think it's
We need to wrap up.
okay.
Yeah. So the final question?
Sure.
Do you want to do it? You want me to?
Yeah, we always end by offering our guests the opportunity to just have some closing thoughts to our audience about how to lift their spirit. And it really can be, come from, what lifts your spirit, or what you've seen has lifted other spirits. It's just a kind of closing remark for the...
So one of the things that I think is so interesting about Daoism is that it has a very distinct physical component and even requirement to it. That Daoism in practice really needs to be something that you do, not something that we sit and think about or something that we sit and talk about, but requires a physical engagement. So for me, I think having been so involved in Daoism and Tai Chi now for a number of years, having that physical mind, body, spirit connection is the thing that's important. And so I found that through Tai Chi and the other arts that I practice. And so I would encourage your audience to, whatever their philosophy or tradition is, find some way to physically manifest that, right? Through the way you live and the things that you do in your interactions. I think that really becomes the important part of our spirituality.
Yeah, living in a fully embodied way. So important. Thank you, Chris a lot for coming in here. This has been really great, and I feel I've learned a lot, and just feel like I'm just starting to understand a little bit.
Yeah.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you again for having me, and happy to talk some more whenever we can.
Great, thanks. And thank you, listeners and viewers, and hope you tune in again in future months for our shows. And if you go to the PortMedia website and pick out playlists for YouTube, you'll find all the previous shows available there.